Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope that you're exceedingly well, and loads of love to each and every one of you. But before we get started, don't forget to treat yourself to a lovely hot cup of chocolate, or perhaps you fancy some tea or coffee or a cold drink, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sherry, and I'm from the southeastern American state of Kentucky, known as the Bluegrass State, sectioned by the Ohio River in the north and the Appalachian Mountains to the south. Frankfurt is our state capital, and Louisville our largest city. We are also known as the horse capital of the world, as there are so many thoroughbred farms here in the Lexington area, and we're renowned for possessing some of the most prepossessing, charming small towns in the States. Growing up in the early 80s, I was exceedingly fortunate to grow up in a small pastoral farm in close proximity to a very pretty, quaint small town, full of southerly charm and very warm, friendly, convivial people, where everybody knew each other, and gossip in those days was literally our only form of social media, as we didn't have the technology that we have today. In our town, we did have our local talebearer, or newsmonger if you like, who was a very discerning, inquisitive woman called Mrs. Eleanor Partridge, who did possess those quintessential beady hawk-like eyes that gave you the very distinct impression that she saw everything and missed nothing, for indeed she appeared to know everybody else's business, and I always wondered where she got her accurate information from. It would seem that she knew things long before the rest of the townsfolk ever did, but credit to her, she was rather a good judge of character. "I don't like Farmer Townsend," she told us once. "There's something exceedingly nefarious about him that gives me the heebie-jeebies. Those creepy eyes of his are as cold as the ice cubicles in my freezer, and if I ever see him smile at all, the crystal in my home will just shatter from the shock. As for that poor wife of his, I don't think I've ever heard her say a single word. She looks so demure and afraid, poor thing, like a mouse that's petrified of the house cat. And I think we can safely assume that the house cat she's terrified of is Mr. Townsend himself, her very own husband." Farmer Silas Townsend lived in the neighbouring farm to us, and as far as we knew, no one in the town had ever been invited around to his property, which was more than a little odd, because in those days people entertained a great deal, as southerly social hospitality was an inherent and intrinsic part of our lifestyle. Most of the people kept a wary distance from Silas Townsend. It was clear that no one would sit next to him in the church pew, and if he was walking on your side of the pavement, you would instinctively cross over to the other side, almost as if you were avoiding bumping into the aggressive dog. It's hard to explain, but he gave off that creepy kind of vibe. To look at, he was relatively normal, rather unremarkable really. He had a slender, very medium build, and it was hard to tell exactly how old he was. At the time I would have guessed he was in his 40s. I remember he did have a long angular face and a thin mouth that always seemed to be turned upside down, as if he was always scowling, and he had a deep-set pair of soulless dark brown eyes. My stout, buxom, fun-loving mother was always wearing an apron around her ample form and waving around a wooden spoon in her hand. She was a great southern cook, and in her day had been quite a beauty, but her love of soul food had cost her waistline dearly. My amazing mother had a heart like the softest marshmallow, as she just always saw the good in everybody, and she came to Mr. Townsend's defence when people ever talked badly about him. "Poor Mr. Townsend," she piped. "People around here are so cruel and heartless in an unkind way. Just because he doesn't smile and is so evasive does not mean that he's a nasty man. Maybe he's just misunderstood." "You just see the good in everybody, Annie," said my father, kissing her lovingly on the cheek. "That's why I love you so much, as there's not a mean bone in your body. But you're wrong about this, dear. You mark my words. Something's not right about Mr. Townsend." Growing up, I was incredibly close to my father, who was self-employed and spent his time restoring and fixing fences for farms in the area. My father always described me as his blue-eyed girl, so he called me Peaches. I had 4 brothers, all older than me, and so I think my father was so delighted to finally have a daughter, and we had a very special father-daughter bond. Our picturesque rustic farm in those days had 2 large silvery ponds, a very sizable stables, a couple of quaint-looking barns with arresting red roofs, pretty wild meadows, and undulating verdant valleys that were dotted with ubiquitous trees such as red maple, cypress, beeches. And it was at this very special time of the day that we would see the charming indigenous wildlife frequenting the pond to drink, like the aloof-looking deer, or the cautious raccoons, or we would watch the rabbits bobbing around our lawn happily. In our town there had been reports of a wild man living in the local area that had been sighted from time to time, and he was described as being like a giant, covered in hair with very overlong arms. But sightings of the man had been so brief and random, so no one knew much about him, and some suggested that the reports were just fictitious, with no real foundation or evidence, and others suggested it was just a vagrant on the loose who had grown very wild. One day as my dad and I were returning home from a shopping trip to the local town, we encountered Mrs. Partridge at the local store, who'd filled us in on all the gossip. "Do you know," she told us, "I saw Mrs. Townsend at the hospital the other day. She was being treated for a broken wrist, and I could tell she was walking very badly because she was hobbling around as if she'd hurt her leg. I promise you that Mr. Townsend is a snake in the grass. You mark my words. I'm willing to bet he did this to her." "That's a bit extreme, Mrs. Partridge," said my father. "Mr. Townsend may not be the most likeable man in the town, but I hardly think he's a monster. There's possibly a very plausible explanation as to what has happened to her. She probably just slipped and fell." Well, what I did learn was that Mr. Townsend informed the doctor that his wife had a nasty fall down their staircase, but there's more to this than meets the eye. I saw Mrs. Townsend being treated by that doctor, and she looked so frightened, poor thing. "What were you doing at the hospital, Miss Partridge?" asked my father quizzically. "Oh, I just like to drop off some flowers to the reception from time to time to brighten the place up, and to speak to the lovely ladies there," she told us. When my dad and I got back into our car for the drive back home, we both cracked up with laughter. "I can see it clearly," said my father. "I think I can safely say that Mrs. Partridge, bless her soul, is visiting the hospital not to drop off flowers, but to find out all the latest gossip. That woman has a nose on her for a good story." "She should be a reporter," I said. "I think she would be a great gossip columnist." "Good point," said my father. "She could put those other journalists out there to shame, because she'd get the scoop long before they even got the chance to get it. They just make things up as they go, but Mrs. Partridge always gets the facts." As my father and I were driving back down the uneven, craggy dirt road towards our farm, we noticed something very large standing in the corner of the road. Our first thought was that it was a bear, as it was covered in long, flowing hair, and was very large in size. "Look, a bear," said my father, slowing down the car as we drove past. It was not uncommon to see a bear in these parts, of course, but this one was a lighter brown colour. All of a sudden, the creature stood upright on his 2 powerful, muscular long legs, and his shoulders and head turned around at the same time to look at us directly. We couldn't believe what we were discerning, as the creature was most certainly not a bear. The only way I can describe him to you is that he looked like a giant man, covered with long, flowing brown hair, with a few ape-like influences to his appearance, mostly seen in his cone-shaped head and his overlong arms. But in every other capacity, he was alarmingly human. I realised that these spurious reports, allegations and accounts were possibly true. Everything suddenly happened so quickly, as the last thing my dad wanted to do was to presumptuously stop the car and stare or ogle at the critter like an animal in the zoo, because that seemed so impertinent, rude and discourteous, especially when the creature was so human. So he just slowed down his driving pace to get a good view of the wild man, who just stared in at us as we drove by. All I remember was that he was absolutely enormous, and his deep-set dark brown eyes seemed inquisitive but also kind. My father estimated that the wild man must have easily been over 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and about 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. And incidentally, his shoulders were massive, as indeed his whole body was sinewy, fibrous and muscular. I do not recall us being frightened at all. We possibly should have been, given the size of this wild man. I think my father and I were caught so off guard and assailed by surprise, as we hadn't anticipated such a random, unexpected encounter, and I believe we were way too astonished and bewildered for fear to even creep into the equation. When you see something so outlandish and incredulous for the first time, I think it has the capacity to desensitize your emotional alarm response, because it seemed like what you're perceiving is so preposterous that it can't really be real. I remember as we drove back down the dirt road towards our farmhouse, my father and I did not say a single word for quite a while. It was like we were so stunned that we could not articulate our thoughts into words, and it was so deathly silent in our car you could have almost heard a pin drop. My father turned around to me and said, "Peaches, did we really see what I thought we saw? Or was I dreaming?" "You mean, did we see the giant wild man?" I said. "Well, yes, we did." As you can imagine, my father and I literally could not wait over the dinner table that night to tell everybody what we'd seen returning home from the store. "Peaches and I have a little secret to share with you all," my father announced, winking at me. "Shall I tell them, Peaches, or do you want to?" "We saw a wild man today," I piped excitedly. "He was like a giant covered in hair." "You saw the wild man?" said Garth, one of my brothers. "That's not fair. Where did you see him?" "Close to the farm," I said, glancing around at the glum faces, as it was clear to see that all my brothers felt remarkably cheated not to have seen him for themselves. My mother began to clear away the dinner plates. Poor wild man," she said. "I so wish we could invite him over for dinner. It can't be easy living out there in the wild like that. I imagine his body is adapted to the cold, which is why he's probably grown all that body hair. I expect he has to hunt for all his food. I so wish I could offer him some of my delicious apple pie." "He's a wild man, sweetheart," exclaimed my father. "He possibly wouldn't understand our way of life, any more than we could understand his. I imagine he's a forager and a hunter, just like the ancients used to be. It's all he knows. He doesn't understand our way of life." Fast forward a few weeks, and one morning we could see the small willowy body of Mrs. Townsend knocking frantically at our front door. What on earth was she doing on our farm, I wondered, and why was she still wearing her nightgown at 11 o'clock in the morning? More to the point, she looked very discomposed and distressed, and her normally neatly ponytailed hair looked very dishevelled. My mother quickly led her into the living room, while I hid behind the couch, because my inquisitive curiosity had got the better of me, as I was eager to find out what on earth was going on, for this was a very impromptu call, and I'd never ever seen Mrs. Townsend on her own, nor had I ever heard her say a single word. "That's better," said my mother. "The colour's coming back to your cheeks, dear. They use brandy all the time in the Swiss Alps when they rescue people from the icy mountain slopes, from avalanches and things like that with their St. Bernards. It's so great for shock. Do you want to tell me what's going on, dear?" "Silas is dead," she said. You could hear a pin drop in the room as everything became eerily silent. "Silas is dead," she repeated. "Oh, I'm so sorry," said my mother. "I don't know what to say. When on earth did this happen?" "Last night, at about 10:30 to be precise." "Wow, I never knew Silas had any health issues," said my mother. "I do hope he didn't suffer. Was it a heart attack or a stroke, dear?" "Silas didn't have any health problems." "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry," said my mother. "I think that's almost worse, really." "I'm not," said Seraphine, which was the first name of Mrs. Townsend. "He deserves everything he got. He was a mean old bully. He never stopped beating me up day or night. I promise you the littlest thing would set him off, like if I didn't pass him the salt or pepper at the dinner table, or if I left a smudge mark on the window." "Oh, I'm so sorry," said my mother. No one deserves that. I did hear about your accident recently with your broken wrist and your bruised leg. That was no accident, said Seraphine. Silas pushed me down the stairs on purpose and called me a silly old bat. If you think of any derogatory name, I've been called them all. Believe me, I have. That's appalling, dear. You should have reported him to the sheriff, said my mother. Men like him want locking up. If I had done that, his twin brother would have been around like a shot to finish me off, and I would have disappeared from the face of the earth and been buried somewhere in the woods over there, never to be seen or heard from again. Those two were as thick as thieves, and as insidiously duplicitous as each other. Silas was not a good man. Did you kill him? Asked my mother. In self-defence, of course. I mean, it's perfectly understandable if you did, and no one could judge you for that in the circumstances. Oh, heavens, no. I didn't kill him. I couldn't have done that. Well, then, what happened, dear? Please, can I have another tot of brandy to calm my nerves? I keep shaking. Of course, dear, said my mother, handing her another tot of brandy, which she drank down in one gulp. I think I should tell you the whole story from the beginning, said Seraphine, just so you understand exactly what happened, so you can wisely advise me on what to say to the sheriff. Well, dear, I'm no expert on police matters, but I will do what I can to help, said my mother, so tell me your story. Well, Silas had been in a bad mood all day yesterday. Don't get me wrong, he's always grumpy. That's not unusual, but there are levels to his mood. And when he's very mad, he walks around kicking everything from the dog to the sides of the house. I call this his level A mood, and I do my level best to stay out of his way to avoid being beaten from an inch of my life. The dogs are nowhere to be seen when Silas is in a level A mood, as they're terrified of him, and they can sense when he's like this. You poor thing, said my mother. That's got to be an awful way for anybody to live, walking on eggshells all the time. Anyway, I was cooking dinner for Silas that evening, and I was making him his very special meatloaf dish to appease him according to his favourite recipe, which he insists on my using a few pinches of cloves to spice up the dish. But I discovered that I'd run out of cloves, and so I cooked the meatloaf without the spice, and he took a couple of bites of it and threw the meatloaf at the wall in a complete rage, creating a chaotic mess over the kitchen. There is no spice in this meatloaf, he screamed. You've made a disaster. This food is disgusting. The meatloaf is insipid. It's bland. It's awful. In that moment he blew up like a volcano, spewing hot molten lava, and I knew by his enraged look he was about to throttle me like a rabid wild dog, as he began foaming at the mouth. So in terror I bolted out of the kitchen, while he pursued me with his hunting rifle, firing a few shots after me as I ran into the woods as fast as I could. My mother looked at Seraphine in astonishment. You mean he fired at you with his hunting rifle? Am I getting that right? He literally fired at his own wife? Oh, yes, he did. And he wasn't playing games with me either. I sense he meant to kill me, and I ran into the woods screaming. I was so terrified. I kept praying, God, oh God, please help me. Don't let me die. Please help me. I could see he was standing only yards away from me, with his rifle in his hand, aiming it directly at me. And I knew then that I was dead. I was begging him not to shoot. I said, Silas, please, don't shoot, don't shoot. And he just laughed at me. He began to laugh at me. It was all a big joke to him. All of a sudden, something massive and Herculean in size came trumpeting through the trees like a huge, angry elephant in full charge, and it seized the rifle from my husband's hands and literally bent it in half and threw it into the bushes. This thing was growling furiously and fiercely like a very aggressive, dangerous lion, with his mouth curled backwards to expose his big, white, glistening teeth. He screamed at Silas in such a loud, loud noise that it caused the ground to completely shake. What was this thing? Asked my mother. It was a giant wild man, covered in long brown hair and incredibly large. He did have ape-like aspects to his appearance. I know it's hard to believe, but it's really true. Oh, I believe you, said my mother. My daughter and husband have both seen the wild man before. What did he do next? Well, my husband began to scream with terror as the wild man picked him up by the waist as if he was a tiny doll, and he began slamming him hard against the tree. And on the first blow I could see he was dead, but the wild man never stopped. He kept beating my husband's body until it broke apart like a china doll, and his flesh looked like blobs of jelly splattered everywhere. "Oh, goodness," said my mother, "that must have been a horrendous thing to watch." Well, I knew the wild man had definitely saved my life, so I was very grateful and thankful to him. I could tell he was very angry indeed with my husband's treatment of me, and when he glanced up at me, I noted he had kind, warm, congenial eyes. He seemed very concerned about my welfare. The wild man then just glided away into the woods and was gone from my sight. "Wow," said my mother, "the man's a hero." "My point is," said Seraphim, "what am I going to do?" "Well," said my mother, "if I were in your shoes, I would report my husband missing after going hunting in the woods, and then the sheriff will send out a search party, and they'll find the bullet casings and stumble across your husband's body, and will assume he was attacked by a bear that tried to kill him. If you tell the sheriff about the wild man, you'll not sound credible at all, and even if he were to believe you, the last thing you want is to get that wild man into trouble, as he saved your life, so you are somewhat indebted to him." "Well, that's my thinking too," said Seraphim. "But what shall I do about my husband's brother? What if he comes after me? What if he tries to kill me? He won't blame you for his brother's death, especially after that police report that will confirm a bear attack. I mean, what would you have to do with that? But I think to be safe, you should stay with us until the whole thing boils over." And so it was that Seraphim stayed with us for a few weeks, until the investigation was finally closed, as the coroner reported that Mr. Townsend had been ravaged by a bear. My mother went to the woods and left apple pies for the wild man, and they were eaten, as the containers were left at Seraphim's kitchen door, so I think he must have enjoyed them. Well, at least I hope he did. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what a fabulous story. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.